I walked into my childhood home expecting Sunday dinner like always, but something felt different. My parents, Robert and Linda, sat stiffly across from our old oak dining table, and their family lawyer, Mr. Patterson, was there too. Mom placed her weathered hand on official documents, looked me straight in the eye, and said the words that would change everything. "You are not getting a single cent. Everything goes to Jessica and Brandon." I smiled calmly, put down my silverware, and stood up. Then the nightmare began. The drive to my downtown apartment felt longer than usual, even though the route from my parents' suburban neighborhood to the city center normally took 23 minutes. The silence in my car was deafening compared to the chaos I had just left behind. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I replayed the scene over and over in my mind. Walking into my modern apartment, I poured myself a glass of water and sat on my leather couch. The contrast between my life and my family's situation had never been more apparent. While I lived in a renovated loft with exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the business district, my parents still occupied the same three-bedroom ranch house where I grew up, now showing its age with peeling paint and a sagging front porch. The irony wasn't lost on me. For the past 5 years, I had been the financial backbone holding our family together. Every month I transferred $800 to cover their mortgage payment, another $300 for property taxes, and whatever medical expenses Medicare didn't cover for Dad's diabetes medication and Mom's arthritis treatments. When their 12-year-old Honda broke down last winter, I bought them a reliable used Toyota without hesitation. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, my girlfriend of 2 years. She was working late at the hospital again, but wanted to know how dinner went. I stared at the message, unsure how to even begin explaining what had just happened. Sarah worked as a pediatric nurse and understood family dynamics better than most people, but this situation would challenge even her optimism about human nature. I thought about my sister Jessica, 32 years old and still trying to find herself. She had bounced between part-time jobs at retail stores, coffee shops, and reception desks for the past decade. 2 years ago, I loaned her $15,000 to start a bakery business that failed within 8 months. Last year, I gave her another $12,000 for an online boutique selling handmade jewelry that never got off the ground. Each time she promised to pay me back once she got established, but those promises evaporated like morning dew. Then there was Brandon, my younger brother at 28. He dropped out of college twice, first from State University, where he lasted 1 semester before academic probation, then from community college where he barely attended classes. His gambling problem started small with weekend poker games, but escalated to casino visits and online betting that drained his bank account regularly. When he hit rock bottom 18 months ago, I paid $28,000 for his rehabilitation program at a private facility in Colorado. The rehabilitation worked mostly. Brandon had been clean from gambling for 14 months now, but he still struggled with steady employment. He worked occasional construction jobs and lived in a studio apartment that I helped him rent when he got out of treatment. Every week I sent him $200 for groceries and basic expenses, telling myself it was temporary support while he rebuilt his life. As I sat in my apartment, the full scope of my financial contributions became clear. Beyond the major expenses, there were countless smaller ones. Christmas gifts for my niece Emma, Jessica's 7-year-old daughter. Birthday dinners at restaurants my parents could never afford. Emergency repairs when their furnace broke down in February. New tires for their car when the old ones became unsafe. Insurance deductibles when Mom needed cataract surgery. My consulting business had grown steadily since I started it right after college. What began as freelance marketing work for small companies had evolved into a firm with 6 employees and contracts with major corporations across 3 states. We specialized in helping businesses optimize their operations and increase profitability, which meant I understood numbers and financial planning better than most people. The cruel twist in my parents' decision started to make sense in a warped way. Jessica and Brandon needed the inheritance because they had never learned to support themselves independently. I had proven I could succeed without family money, so in their minds, I didn't require the same assistance. They were rewarding failure and punishing success, creating a system where struggling earned inheritance while achievement earned nothing. Sarah arrived at my apartment around 9:30, still wearing her hospital scrubs decorated with cartoon animals that made her young patients smile. She took one look at my face and knew something serious had happened. I explained the entire situation while she listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or squeezing my hand for support. When I finished, Sarah was quiet for several minutes. Finally, she spoke with the gentle wisdom that made her such an effective nurse. Ellis, I think your parents love all of you, but they have no idea how to show it properly. They have been depending on your generosity for so long that they forget you have a choice in giving it. Maybe this is an opportunity to establish healthier boundaries. Her words resonated, but the emotional sting remained fresh. I had built my entire adult relationship with my family around being their provider and protector. Suddenly, I felt like a fool for believing that unconditional support would earn me unconditional love in return. That night, I lay awake calculating exactly how much money I had given my family over the years. The number was staggering. Between direct payments, loans that were never repaid, and countless smaller contributions, I had transferred over $150,000 to my parents and siblings during the past 5 years. That amount could have been a down payment on a house, or invested for my future with Sarah, or saved for the children we hoped to have someday. Instead, it had subsidized a lifestyle where my family members never faced real consequences for their poor decisions. I had enabled them to avoid growing up taking responsibility or learning essential life skills. The inheritance revelation wasn't just about money or property, it was about respect, appreciation, and recognition of my sacrifices for people I loved unconditionally. As dawn approached, I made a decision that would change everything. If my parents wanted to leave their estate to Jessica and Brandon because they needed it more, then they should also take full responsibility for supporting them. My days as the family's financial safety net were officially over. Monday morning arrived with crisp October air and the kind of determination that comes from finally seeing a situation clearly. I sat at my home office desk with my laptop, coffee, and a notepad listing every automatic payment and financial commitment I had made to my family members. The list was longer than I had initially realized. First, I called my bank and canceled the automatic monthly transfer of $800 for my parents' mortgage. The customer service representative asked if I wanted to reschedule the payment for later in the month, but I clearly stated the cancellation was permanent. Next, I stopped the quarterly property tax payment of $900 that was scheduled to process the following week. The medical expense account I had established for my parents' healthcare costs contained over $3,000. I transferred that money back to my primary account and closed the secondary account entirely. Their insurance premiums, which I had been covering for 2 years, were set to automatically renew in November. I contacted the insurance company and removed my credit card as the payment method, informing them that future premiums would need to be paid directly by the policyholders. Jessica's rent assistance required a separate phone call to her landlord, Mrs. Chen, whom I had been paying directly for the past year and a half. I explained that the arrangement was ending immediately and that Jessica would be responsible for her own housing costs moving forward. Mrs. Chen seemed surprised but understanding, mentioning that she had always wondered why a grown woman couldn't pay her own rent. Brandon's weekly allowance was the easiest to stop since it was just a simple bank transfer every Friday. I deleted his information from my mobile banking app and made a note to ignore any requests for emergency money that might come later. The hardest part was canceling the life insurance policy I had purchased for my parents with myself as the beneficiary to ensure they would have proper burial expenses when the time came. The policy cost me $240 monthly, but it represented my deeper fear that they couldn't take care of themselves even in death. By noon, I had systematically dismantled 5 years of financial support in less than 4 hours. The process felt both liberating and terrifying. I was finally setting boundaries that should have existed from the beginning, but I also knew the immediate consequences would be devastating for my family. My phone started ringing around 2 in the afternoon. The first call was from my father, sounding confused rather than angry. Ellis, the bank called about the mortgage payment being declined. Did something happen with your account? I explained calmly that I was no longer covering their household expenses and suggested they contact their financial institution to discuss payment options. The second call came from Jessica 20 minutes later, her voice shaking with panic. Ellis, my landlord, says you stopped paying my rent. How am I supposed to keep my apartment? Where will Emma and I live? I reminded her that she was a 32-year-old woman with a daughter, and that housing was her responsibility, not mine. Brandon texted instead of calling, probably because he was at his construction job. His message was short, but desperate. Bro, my account is empty. Thought your transfer didn't go through. Need grocery money. I responded with an even shorter message. No more transfers. You are on your own now. Sarah stopped by my office during her lunch break, bringing sandwiches from the deli we both enjoyed. She had been thinking about our conversation from the previous night and wanted to make sure I wasn't making decisions based on anger rather than principle. I showed her the list of canceled payments and explained my reasoning. You are not cutting them off to be cruel, she observed after reviewing my notes. You are forcing them to face reality for the first time in years. That is actually the most loving thing you can do, even if they cannot see it yet. Wednesday morning brought a phone call from my mother that I almost didn't answer. When I finally picked up, she was crying harder than I had heard since my grandfather's funeral 15 years earlier. Ellis, we got an eviction notice. Jessica got an eviction notice. The bank is talking about foreclosure. Brandon's boss fired him for missing work. Everything is falling apart and we don't know what to do. The timeline was accelerating faster than I had anticipated. I knew there would be consequences, but I hadn't expected the dominoes to fall quite so quickly. Jessica's landlord had apparently given her a 3-day notice to pay rent or vacate, which meant she had until Saturday to come up with $1,400. My parents had received a formal notice from their mortgage company about the missed payment, starting a process that could lead to foreclosure if not addressed within 30 days. The revelation that Brandon had been fired added a new complication I hadn't foreseen. His supervisor had apparently grown tired of his erratic attendance and frequent Monday absences, which suggested that Brandon might be struggling with more than just financial dependence. That afternoon, Sarah and I met for coffee to discuss the evolving situation. She listened as I described the mounting pressure for my family and the guilt I felt watching them scramble to solve problems I had been solving for them for years. What surprised me most was discovering something I hadn't known before. While going through my financial records to document exactly how much I had been contributing to my family, I found a folder my mother had left at my apartment months earlier. Inside were documents showing that my parents had taken out a second mortgage on their house 2 years ago. The loan amount was $43,000, and according to the paperwork, they had used Jessica's failed bakery business as justification for the loan. This meant that even if Jessica and Brandon inherited the house through the will, they would be inheriting a property with 2 mortgages totaling more than its current market value. My parents had essentially borrowed against their children's inheritance to fund one daughter's business failure without telling anyone about the additional debt. The house that was supposed to be Jessica and Brandon's security blanket was actually a financial burden that would bankrupt them within months. This discovery changed everything. My parents hadn't just excluded me from their will. They had actively diminished the value of what they were leaving to my siblings while using my financial support to cover the payments on their secret debt. I was subsidizing a lie that would eventually destroy Jessica and Brandon financially. When I called my father to ask about the second mortgage, his response was telling. We thought Jessica's business would succeed and pay for itself. When it didn't, we figured you could help us manage the payments until we figured out another plan. The casual assumption that I would cover their financial mistakes indefinitely was breathtaking. The week ended with Jessica showing up at my apartment on Friday evening, holding Emma's hand and carrying 2 suitcases. She had been evicted that morning and had nowhere else to go. Emma looked confused and scared, clutching a stuffed rabbit and asking why they couldn't go home to their own apartment. I spent an hour explaining to Jessica that she could stay for one night while she figured out alternative arrangements, but that moving in with me was not an option. She argued, cried, and eventually accused me of abandoning my family in their time of need. When I showed her the documents about the second mortgage and explained how much money I had contributed to the family over the years, she became quiet. I didn't know about any of that, she finally admitted. Mom and Dad never told us you were paying for so much. We just thought you helped out sometimes when they asked. That night, Emma slept on my couch while Jessica spent hours on the phone trying to find temporary housing. I realized that my siblings had been just as unaware of my financial contributions as I had been of my parents' hidden debt. We had all been operating with incomplete information, making decisions based on assumptions that were fundamentally incorrect. The support system that had held our family together was built on secrets, lies, and financial manipulation that none of us fully understood. Now that it was collapsing, we were all discovering truths that would force us to rebuild our relationships from scratch. Jessica and Brandon arrived at my consulting office the following Monday morning, without an appointment, creating an awkward scene in my professional environment. My receptionist, Amy, looked uncomfortable as she announced their arrival, clearly sensing the family tension that filled our modern waiting area, with its polished concrete floors and contemporary art. Brandon wore the same clothes he'd been wearing for 3 days, suggesting he was sleeping in his car or couch surfing with friends. Jessica looked exhausted, with Emma clinging to her leg and asking repeatedly when they could go home. The sight of my 7-year-old niece in the middle of this adult conflict made my chest tighten with conflicting emotions. I led them to our conference room, a space normally reserved for client presentations with its wall-mounted monitor and sleek glass table. Amy brought coloring books and crayons for Emma, who settled into a corner chair, while the adults prepared for what would become the most brutal family confrontation of our lives. Jessica started the conversation by appealing to my emotions, describing how Emma had been asking why Uncle Ellis didn't love them anymore. She painted vivid pictures of their temporary living situation in a motel room that cost $60 per night, eating fast food because they had no kitchen access, and Emma's confusion about why her routine had been completely disrupted. Brandon took a more aggressive approach, threatening to contact my business clients and tell them how I was abandoning my own family members. He had researched my company online and found testimonials from satisfied customers who praised our commitment to solving problems and supporting growth. Wouldn't those same clients question my character if they knew I was letting my parents face foreclosure while I lived comfortably downtown? The emotional manipulation might have worked on the old version of me, but I had spent the weekend preparing for exactly this conversation. I opened my laptop and displayed a spreadsheet I had created showing every financial contribution I had made to our family over the past 5 years. The numbers filled the large monitor screen, each entry documented with dates, amounts, and purposes. Jessica's face went pale as I walked through the bakery loan that was never repaid, the boutique investment that generated no return, the monthly rent assistance, and countless smaller contributions she had forgotten or never acknowledged. Brandon shifted uncomfortably as I detailed his rehabilitation costs, weekly allowances, car repairs, and emergency funds that had become a regular expectation rather than genuine emergencies. Then I revealed the information that changed everything: the secret second mortgage our parents had taken against the house, using Jessica's business plans as justification for borrowing $43,000 they couldn't afford to repay. I showed them the documents, bank statements, and loan terms that proved our parents had been lying about their financial situation for over 2 years. The room went completely silent except for Emma's quiet humming as she colored a picture of a house with a family standing outside. The innocence of her drawing contrasted sharply with the financial wreckage spread across the conference room table in the form of printed documents and bank records. Jessica was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "You mean the house isn't actually worth anything? If Brandon and I inherit it, we will inherit the debt too." I nodded and explained that the combined mortgages totaled more than the property's current market value, especially considering its deteriorating condition and needed repairs. The inheritance she and Brandon were expecting would actually be a financial burden that could destroy their credit and financial future. Brandon's reaction was explosive. He stood up so quickly that his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. If Mom and Dad knew the house was worthless, why did they make such a big deal about leaving it to us instead of Ellis? What was the point of hurting his feelings if there was no real money involved? The anger in his voice wasn't directed at me anymore. It was aimed at our parents, who had apparently manipulated the inheritance announcement to create family drama around an asset that didn't actually exist. They had broken my heart and divided our family over something that would ultimately harm Jessica and Brandon more than help them. Jessica began crying, but these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of rage and betrayal. She realized that our parents had encouraged her business ventures, knowing they couldn't afford to support them, then borrowed against the family home when those ventures failed, and finally excluded me from the will despite my years of financial sacrifice that had kept the family afloat. Emma looked up from her coloring and asked why everyone was upset. Jessica wiped her eyes and told her daughter they needed to have a serious talk with Grandma and Grandpa about telling the truth. The dynamic in the room had completely shifted. Instead of Jessica and Brandon pressuring me to restore financial support, we were now three siblings united in our realization that our parents had been manipulating all of us through selective information and emotional manipulation. Brandon pulled out his phone and called our father, putting the call on speaker so we could all hear the conversation. When Dad answered, Brandon didn't bother with pleasantries. "Dad, we are at Ellis's office looking at bank records and mortgage documents. We know about the second loan. We know the house is underwater. We know Ellis has been paying your bills for 5 years. What we want to know is why you lied to all of us." The silence on the other end of the phone lasted nearly 30 seconds. When our father finally responded, his voice was defensive and shaky. "We were trying to protect the family. We thought if Ellis knew how bad things were, he would worry too much. We thought if you kids knew how much he was helping you, would feel guilty. We were just trying to hold everything together until we could figure out a better solution." Jessica grabbed the phone from Brandon's hand. "Mom and Dad, this is Jessica. You used my business plan to get a loan you couldn't afford, knowing that Ellis would probably end up covering the payments. You told Ellis we were getting the inheritance while hiding the fact that inheriting your house would bankrupt Brandon and me. You've been lying to everyone while Ellis sacrificed his own financial security to keep us all afloat. That is not protecting the family. That is destroying it." The call ended with our father promising to explain everything if we would come to the house for dinner that evening. None of us agreed to the invitation. Instead, we spent the next 2 hours in my conference room piecing together the full scope of our family's financial situation and our parents' deception. By the time Jessica and Brandon left my office, we had formed an alliance based on truth rather than manipulation. We agreed to maintain distance from our parents until they acknowledged their dishonesty and made genuine efforts to address the underlying problems they had created. Emma gave me a hug before they left, telling me she was sorry I had been sad and asking if we could still have family dinners sometimes. Her innocent question reminded me that beneath all the financial complications and emotional manipulation, we were still a family who loved each other even when the love had been expressed in destructive ways. That evening, I sat in my apartment with Sarah processing the dramatic shift that had occurred during the confrontation. My siblings and I were no longer divided by the will or the inheritance. We were united in recognizing that our parents' approach to family relationships was fundamentally flawed and needed to change before any of us could move forward in a healthy way. The nightmare that had begun with Sunday dinner was evolving into something that might ultimately strengthen our family bonds, but only if everyone was willing to face difficult truths and make substantial changes in how we treated each other. 3 days after the confrontation at my office, I discovered just how interconnected the business community could be in our mid-sized city. During a routine client meeting with Patricia Morrison, the vice president of First National Bank, our conversation unexpectedly turned to local real estate markets and foreclosure trends. Patricia mentioned that the bank was seeing an increase in homeowners struggling with second mortgages, particularly older couples who had borrowed against their equity to help adult children with failed business ventures. When she described one specific case involving a bakery loan that had defaulted, I realized she was talking about my parents. The coincidence didn't end there. Later that week, my consulting firm received a new project request from Henderson Recovery Services, a debt collection agency that specialized in business loan defaults. Their intake form mentioned Jessica's boutique business and the $12,000 in unpaid vendor invoices that had never been resolved. By Friday, I discovered that 4 of my current business clients had direct or indirect connections to my family's financial problems. The rehabilitation center where Brandon had received treatment was owned by Mountain Health Systems, whose parent company was one of my consulting contracts. The law firm handling Jessica's eviction proceedings had recently hired my company to optimize their case management processes. These coincidences presented an ethical dilemma I had never anticipated. My professional relationships were intersecting with my family's personal crisis in ways that could compromise both my business integrity and their privacy. However, they also gave me unprecedented insight into the full scope of their financial obligations and the timeline for potential consequences. During a golf meeting with Tom Peterson, my contact at Mountain Health Systems, he casually mentioned that they had been working with a young man whose family was struggling to maintain payments for his extended care program. The unpaid balance was approaching $18,000, and they would need to pursue collection activities if the account wasn't addressed soon. I recognized immediately that he was describing Brandon's situation. The rehabilitation center had been billing my parents directly for ongoing therapy sessions and support services that extended beyond the initial treatment I'd paid for. My parents had been managing those payments sporadically, probably using credit cards or borrowing from other sources to avoid asking me for additional money. The revelation that Brandon's recovery program was still accumulating charges explained why he had seemed unstable lately and why he had been fired from his construction job. He was probably attending mandatory therapy sessions during work hours without telling his employer about his ongoing treatment requirements. At home, my parents' marriage was showing signs of severe strain under the financial pressure and mounting accusations of dishonesty. Jessica had moved back into her childhood bedroom, with Emma creating overcrowded conditions that made everyone irritable and uncomfortable. The house that had once been a comfortable family gathering place now felt like a pressure cooker. Jessica and Emma's belongings filled the living room, leaving no space for normal activities. Emma's bedtime routine was disrupted by adult conversations about money and lawyers that continued late into the evening. My mother called me on Wednesday morning sounding more defeated than I had ever heard her. "Ellis, your father and I have been married for 34 years, but we are fighting constantly now. He blames me for encouraging Jessica's business ideas. I blame him for taking out the second mortgage without understanding the implications. We both blame ourselves for not being honest with all of you kids from the beginning." Her admission of responsibility was a significant step forward, but it came at a cost. She described how the stress was affecting everyone in the house. Jessica snapped at Emma for minor childhood behaviors that normally wouldn't bother her. Emma was having nightmares and asking repeatedly when they would have their own home again. My father was sleeping on the living room couch because the bedroom felt too crowded with everyone's emotions and belongings. The breaking point came on Friday afternoon when Brandon disappeared without telling anyone where he was going. He had attended a job interview that morning for a warehouse position, but when the potential employer called his references, they discovered the outstanding debt from his rehabilitation program. Jessica found his car in the casino parking lot at 11 o'clock that night. Security guards discovered him passed out in the driver's seat with an empty bottle of whiskey and gambling receipts showing he had lost $300 at slot machines. The money represented his last savings and the cash he needed for basic living expenses. The police were called and Brandon was taken to the emergency room for alcohol poisoning evaluation. The incident violated his rehabilitation program's sobriety requirements and triggered mandatory reporting to his probation officer from an earlier gambling-related legal issue I hadn't known about. Sarah accompanied me to the hospital where we found Jessica pacing in the waiting room while Emma slept across 3 plastic chairs. My parents arrived looking haggard and confused, unsure whether their presence would help or complicate the situation further. The emergency room doctor explained that Brandon's blood alcohol level was dangerously high and that he had mentioned suicidal thoughts to the nursing staff. Hospital protocol required a 72-hour psychiatric hold for evaluation and safety monitoring, regardless of his family's preferences. As we sat in that sterile waiting room, under fluorescent lights, surrounded by the smell of disinfectant and the sound of medical equipment, I realized that my decision to withdraw financial support had accelerated my family's crisis beyond what any of us had anticipated. Jessica looked at me across the waiting room and spoke the words that none of us wanted to acknowledge. "Ellis, we need your help. Not just money, but actually figuring out how to fix this mess we have all created together. Brandon could have died tonight, and our parents are probably going to lose their house. And Emma doesn't understand why her whole world has been turned upside down." The hospital social worker met with us around 3 in the morning, explaining Brandon's treatment options and the legal requirements triggered by his psychiatric hold. She also provided information about family counseling services, financial planning resources, and support programs for children affected by family instability. As dawn broke outside the hospital windows, I found myself in an unexpected position. My withdrawal of financial support had successfully demonstrated how dependent my family had become on my contributions, but it had also created a crisis that threatened to destroy them completely. The original goal of teaching responsibility and establishing healthy boundaries had evolved into something much more complex. My family needed rescue, but this time the solution would require more than just money. It would demand a complete restructuring of how we related to each other and approached our individual responsibilities. Driving home as the sun came up, I realized that I held ultimate power over my family's fate. Not just through my financial resources, but through my professional connections and my understanding of the systems they needed to navigate. The question was no longer whether I would help them, but how I could help them in a way that created lasting positive change rather than temporary relief that would inevitably lead to future crises. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing quarterly reports in my downtown office. My mother called within minutes of the mail delivery, her voice barely controlled, as she read the legal document that gave our family 30 days to bring the mortgage payments, current or face complete loss of the family home. The notice wasn't just about missed payments anymore. The bank had apparently discovered the second mortgage irregularities and was accelerating the entire loan balance due to misrepresentation in the original application. My parents owed $86,000 immediately, or they would lose the house where they had lived for 23 years. Meanwhile, Jessica's situation deteriorated rapidly when her ex-husband Marcus filed an emergency petition for full custody of Emma. His attorney argued that Jessica's housing instability, recent eviction, and temporary living situation with grandparents created an unsafe environment for a 7-year-old child. The custody hearing was scheduled for the following Friday, giving Jessica less than 10 days to demonstrate that she could provide stable housing for her daughter. Marcus had remarried a nurse practitioner named Carol, and they lived in a 4-bedroom house in an excellent school district. On paper, their petition appeared reasonable and in Emma's best interests. Jessica spent her days frantically searching for affordable apartments, but her recent eviction and lack of steady employment made her an unsuitable tenant for most landlords. The few properties she could afford were located in neighborhoods with poor schools and safety concerns that would strengthen Marcus's custody argument. Brandon remained in psychiatric hold at the hospital, where doctors adjusted his medications and evaluated his mental state. The gambling relapse had triggered a cascade of legal and financial consequences that complicated his treatment plan. His rehabilitation program expelled him for violating sobriety requirements, meaning he would need to start over with a different provider if he wanted to continue therapy. The unpaid balance from his original treatment had grown to $23,000 with interest and collection fees. Mountain Health Systems was preparing to file a lawsuit for the outstanding amount, which would result in wage garnishment and damaged credit that could affect his future employment opportunities. My father's stress manifested as a minor heart attack on Wednesday evening, while he was trying to calculate mortgage payment options on his outdated computer. The chest pain started around dinner time, and my mother drove him to the emergency room in their aging Toyota, which broke down in the hospital parking lot with transmission failure. I learned about Dad's medical crisis from a nurse at the cardiac unit who found my contact information in his wallet as his emergency contact. When I arrived at the hospital, I found my mother sitting alone in another sterile waiting room, looking smaller and more fragile than I remembered. The cardiologist explained that the heart attack was relatively minor, but served as a warning sign that Dad's cardiovascular system was struggling with prolonged stress and poor lifestyle management. His blood pressure medication needed adjustment, and he would require ongoing monitoring to prevent more serious cardiac events. While Dad recovered in the coronary care unit, Mom finally broke down completely and told me everything. The financial deception had started small with minor omissions about late bills and credit card balances. When Jessica's bakery failed, they took out the second mortgage believing that her next business venture would succeed and generate enough income to manage the additional payments. They had been living month to month for over 3 years using my financial contributions to cover basic expenses while making minimum payments on increasing debt balances. The will decision wasn't really about fairness or family planning. It was about desperation and their realization that Jessica and Brandon would inherit financial obligations they couldn't handle independently. My parents had convinced themselves that excluding me from the inheritance was actually protecting me from inheriting their debt problems. They assumed I would continue providing financial support regardless of the will's contents, while Jessica and Brandon would at least have property ownership to help them secure loans or housing assistance in the future. The logic was flawed, but it revealed how completely they misunderstood both my financial capabilities and my emotional needs. They saw me as inexhaustibly resourceful and financially stable, not recognizing that my success required careful planning and ongoing effort that could be disrupted by unlimited family obligations. Thursday morning brought news that made everything more complicated. My business competitor, Richard Hayes from Synergy Solutions, had apparently been monitoring the local foreclosure listings and identified my parents' property as a potential acquisition target. Richard contacted the bank directly and submitted a preliminary offer to purchase the house at auction for $62,000, which was approximately 70% of its estimated market value. His plan was to demolish the existing structure and develop the lot into commercial office space, taking advantage of its proximity to the expanding business district. The bank was interested in Richard's proposal because it guaranteed a specific sale amount and eliminated the uncertainty of public auction bidding. However, the sale price would leave my parents with over $20,000 in remaining debt after the mortgages were satisfied, creating a deficiency balance they would be legally obligated to pay. I knew Richard's business practices well enough to understand his strategy. He specialized in acquiring distressed properties from families who couldn't afford legal representation or didn't understand their options for preventing foreclosure. His developments were profitable, but often displaced longtime residents who had deep community connections. The irony wasn't lost on me. The property where I had learned to ride a bicycle, hosted birthday parties, and created childhood memories was about to be purchased by someone who viewed it purely as a commodity to be destroyed for commercial gain. My mother's phone call that evening was different from her previous desperate pleas for help. Instead of asking me to rescue the family financially, she asked if I could help them understand their options and make informed decisions about their remaining choices. Ellis, I know we have made terrible mistakes and hurt you deeply, but I am not calling to ask for money. I am calling to ask for your expertise and guidance. You understand business and finance better than any of us. Can you help us figure out the best way to handle this situation, even if it means we lose the house? Her request represented a fundamental shift in our family dynamic. Instead of positioning herself as a victim requiring rescue, she was acknowledging my skills and asking for professional consultation. The change in approach suggested that the crisis might be creating opportunities for more honest and respectful relationships between us. Sarah and I spent Friday evening researching foreclosure law bankruptcy options and family mediation services. We identified several potential strategies that could help my parents avoid complete financial destruction while addressing the underlying problems that had created the crisis. However, any sustainable solution would require cooperation from all family members and a willingness to make substantial lifestyle changes that might feel uncomfortable initially but would provide long-term stability and independence. The power dynamic had shifted completely. My parents were no longer making demands or manipulating emotions to secure financial support. They were asking for help in learning how to solve their own problems with dignity and integrity. Jessica and Brandon were no longer fighting about inheritance rights or blaming me for withdrawing support. They were focused on immediate survival issues and recognizing that their futures depended on developing genuine self-sufficiency rather than depending on family subsidies. Emma's welfare had become the priority that motivated everyone's decisions, creating a shared goal that transcended individual financial interests and personal grievances. For the first time in years, our family was operating as a team, working toward common objectives rather than individuals competing for limited resources. The crisis that had threatened to destroy us was also creating opportunities for building stronger, more honest relationships based on mutual respect and shared responsibility. Saturday morning, I sent a text message to Jessica, Brandon, and my parents, requesting that everyone meet at my lawyer's office Monday afternoon at 2 o'clock. The message was formal and brief. We need to discuss a comprehensive plan for addressing our family's financial situation and moving forward in a healthy way for everyone involved, including Emma. I spent the weekend working with my attorney, David Richardson, to draft a detailed proposal that could address each family member's immediate needs while establishing sustainable long-term arrangements. David specialized in family financial planning and had experience with complex situations involving multiple generations and competing interests. The plan I developed was comprehensive but conditional. Every family member would need to meet specific requirements and demonstrate genuine commitment to change before receiving assistance. The goal was creating independence and responsibility rather than continued dependence and enabling. Monday afternoon, we gathered in David's conference room, a space designed to facilitate difficult family discussions with comfortable seating, natural lighting, and privacy from outside distractions. David began the meeting by explaining confidentiality rules and his role as a neutral facilitator rather than an advocate for any individual family member. I presented the proposal I had spent the weekend developing, using printed documents and a presentation screen to ensure everyone understood the details and requirements. The plan addressed immediate crisis issues while establishing frameworks for long-term financial stability and healthier family relationships. For my parents, I proposed purchasing their house directly for $88,000, which would pay off both mortgages and provide them with a small amount of equity to facilitate their transition to more affordable housing. They would have the option to remain in the house as tenants, paying reasonable rent that reflected their actual income rather than mortgage payments they couldn't afford. The rental arrangement would be temporary, lasting no more than 2 years, while they downsized to a senior living apartment or smaller home that matched their fixed income from Social Security and Dad's pension. The transition period would give them time to adjust to their new financial reality without the stress of immediate displacement. Jessica's situation required more complex intervention. I offered to cover her legal expenses for the custody hearing and provide a security deposit for a suitable apartment, but only after she completed a 16-week financial management course and found full-time employment with health insurance benefits. The job requirement wasn't arbitrary. Emma needed stability and health care coverage, and Jessica needed to prove to both the court and herself that she could provide consistently for her daughter without relying on family financial support. I had already researched several companies that offered entry-level positions with advancement opportunities and benefits packages. Brandon's path forward involved the most stringent requirements because his situation involved legal, medical, and financial complications that needed careful coordination. He would need to complete a new rehabilitation program, maintain sobriety for 6 consecutive months, and participate in weekly financial counseling sessions before receiving any direct assistance. However, I had arranged for him to start working with my consulting firm's facilities management company, which offered steady employment with supervision and support systems that would accommodate his recovery needs. The job included health insurance that would cover ongoing therapy and medication costs. The position was entry-level, but provided opportunities for advancement based on performance and reliability. The company owner, Michael Torres, was a friend who understood addiction recovery and was willing to provide the structured environment that would support Brandon's long-term success. All family members would be required to participate in monthly family counseling sessions designed to improve communication, establish healthy boundaries, and develop conflict resolution skills that would prevent future crises. The counseling wasn't optional and would continue for at least 1 year. David explained the legal documents that would formalize these arrangements, including property transfer agreements, rental leases, employment contracts, and family meeting protocols. Everything would be documented to ensure accountability and prevent misunderstandings that had contributed to our current problems. Jessica was the first to respond, asking questions about the timeline for finding employment and whether the financial management course could be completed online or would require in-person attendance. Her questions were practical rather than emotional, suggesting she was approaching the proposal seriously rather than looking for ways to avoid the requirements. Brandon's reaction surprised everyone. Instead of negotiating the terms or expressing resentment about the conditions, he thanked me for providing a structured plan that addressed his specific needs rather than just offering money that wouldn't solve his underlying problems. My parents were quiet for several minutes before my father spoke. "Ellis, this plan is more generous than we deserve, and the requirements are exactly what we need to learn how to manage our lives responsibly. We accept everything you have proposed, and we are grateful for the opportunity to rebuild our family relationships on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect." The meeting continued for another 2 hours as David explained each document and requirement in detail. We established timelines, identified resources for meeting various requirements, and created accountability measures that would track everyone's progress toward their individual goals. Emma would benefit from the stability this plan provided, with her mother gaining steady employment and housing her uncle receiving treatment and support for his recovery, and her grandparents transitioning to a living situation they could afford independently. The most significant revelation came when I explained how I had discovered the interconnections between my business clients and the family's financial problems. Instead of using those connections to harm anyone, I had leveraged them to create opportunities for employment treatment and legal assistance that wouldn't have been available otherwise. Mountain Health Systems agreed to restructure Brandon's outstanding debt as part of his renewed treatment program. Henderson Recovery Services offered Jessica a bookkeeping position that would utilize her organizational skills while providing the steady employment she needed for the custody hearing. First National Bank extended the foreclosure timeline to allow for orderly property transfer rather than forced auction. By the end of the meeting, we had signed preliminary agreements and established a schedule for implementing each aspect of the plan. More importantly, we had created a framework for rebuilding our family relationships based on accountability support and realistic expectations rather than financial manipulation and emotional blackmail. David scheduled follow-up meetings for the following month to review progress and address any complications that arose during implementation. He also provided contact information for the family counselor who would be working with us to develop healthier communication patterns and relationship dynamics. Leaving the lawyer's office, I felt a combination of relief and cautious optimism. The comprehensive plan addressed everyone's immediate needs while creating pathways for long-term independence and stability. However, success would depend on each family member's willingness to follow through on their commitments and embrace the changes required for genuine improvement. The nightmare that had begun with Sunday dinner was transforming into an opportunity for building the kind of family relationships we should have had all along based on love, respect, and mutual support, rather than financial dependence and emotional manipulation. 6 months later, our family dinner table looked completely different than it had the night everything changed. We were gathered in the same dining room of my childhood home, but the atmosphere was filled with genuine warmth and celebration rather than tension and hidden resentments. Jessica sat beside Emma, both of them radiating a confidence and contentment I hadn't seen in years. Jessica had successfully completed her financial management course with a 94% average and had been promoted to senior bookkeeper at Henderson Recovery Services after just 4 months of exemplary performance. Her apartment near Emma's school was modest but comfortable, decorated with Emma's artwork, and furnished with pieces Jessica had chosen and purchased with her own money. The custody hearing had been resolved in Jessica's favor when Marcus and Carol recognized that she had transformed her life circumstances and could provide the stable environment Emma needed. They had actually developed a cooperative co-parenting arrangement that gave Emma consistent time with both families while maintaining her primary residence with Jessica. Emma was thriving academically and socially in her new school, having made several close friends and joined the elementary school choir that performed at community events. Her nightmares had stopped completely once her living situation stabilized, and she had started asking thoughtful questions about money management and saving for things she wanted. Brandon looked healthier than I had seen him in over a decade. His face had filled out, his eyes were clear and focused, and he carried himself with the quiet dignity that comes from genuine self-respect. He had maintained complete sobriety for 7 months and had been promoted to supervisor at the facilities management company, earning recognition for his reliability and problem-solving skills. His apartment was small but organized, and he had started saving money for the first time in his adult life. The weekly financial counseling sessions had taught him budgeting skills and helped him understand the emotional triggers that had contributed to his gambling addiction. He was also volunteering at a recovery center, sharing his experience with other people struggling with similar challenges. My parents had transitioned to a senior living community called Meadowbrook Gardens, where they occupied a comfortable 2-bedroom apartment with access to social activities, meal services, and healthcare support. The community was specifically designed for active seniors who wanted independence with available assistance, and they had made several friendships with neighbors who shared similar interests and life experiences. Their marriage had not only survived the crisis, but had been strengthened by the counseling process and their renewed commitment to honesty and mutual support. Dad's cardiac health had improved with better stress management and regular exercise programs offered by the community. Mom had joined a quilting group and was learning to use a computer to stay connected with Emma through video calls. The family home had been renovated and converted into offices for my expanding consulting business. The kitchen became a break room, the bedrooms were transformed into private offices, and the living room became a conference space. Having my business located in the place where I grew up created a meaningful connection between my personal history and professional achievements. The renovation project had become a symbol of transformation and positive change that honored our family's history while creating something new and productive. Clients often commented on the warm, welcoming atmosphere of our offices and the obvious care that had been invested in creating a space that balanced professional functionality with personal meaning. More importantly, I had established the Ellis Family Foundation, a nonprofit organization that provided scholarships and financial education programs for families struggling with debt management and financial planning. The foundation operated from a portion of the renovated house, creating a legacy that would help other families avoid the mistakes we had made. The foundation's programs included workshops on budgeting and saving support groups for families affected by gambling addiction and educational resources for young adults learning to manage money independently. Jessica volunteered as a facilitator for some of the financial management workshops, sharing her personal experience to help other women develop confidence in handling their finances. Brandon contributed to the foundation's outreach efforts, speaking to high school students about the importance of making responsible financial decisions and recognizing the warning signs of addictive behaviors. His presentations were powerful and authentic, combining personal testimony with practical advice that resonated with young people facing similar pressures. The monthly family counseling sessions had evolved into informal family meetings where we discussed challenges, celebrated achievements, and maintained the communication patterns we had learned during the crisis. These meetings ensured that problems were addressed promptly rather than being allowed to grow into major conflicts. Sarah and I had gotten engaged 3 months earlier with a small celebration that included all the family members who had become such important parts of our life together. Emma served as flower girl, Jessica helped with wedding planning, and Brandon offered to coordinate transportation for elderly relatives. My parents provided family photos and stories that helped Sarah understand the history and tradition she was joining. The engagement ring had been purchased with money I had saved by no longer subsidizing my family's poor financial decisions. Instead of feeling guilty about spending money on myself and my future with Sarah, I felt proud of creating healthy boundaries that allowed everyone to prosper according to their own efforts and choices. Our wedding was planned for the following spring, with a reception in the gardens behind the renovated family home. The celebration would represent not just the beginning of my marriage to Sarah, but the successful transformation of our family's relationships from dependence and manipulation to independence and mutual support. The Foundation's scholarship program had already helped 12 families avoid foreclosure through financial education and counseling services. 3 young adults had received college scholarships that emphasized both academic achievement and demonstrated understanding of personal financial responsibility. Emma had started a savings account with money she earned from small chores and gifts from family members. She was learning to set financial goals and make decisions about spending versus saving that would serve her well throughout her life. Her involvement in these decisions had made her more thoughtful about money and more appreciative of the things she received. As we finished dinner that evening, Emma asked a question that revealed how much our family had grown and changed. "Uncle Ellis, do you think our family is happier now than before, even though everyone had to work harder to take care of themselves?" Her innocent question prompted a discussion about the difference between temporary happiness based on avoiding responsibility and lasting satisfaction that comes from personal growth and genuine achievement. Emma understood that our family was stronger because everyone had learned to contribute rather than just receive. The nightmare that had begun with my parents' will announcement had ultimately become the catalyst for creating the kind of family we should have been all along. We had learned to love each other without enabling destructive behaviors, to support each other without creating dependence, and to maintain individual independence while preserving family connections. The will itself had been revised to reflect everyone's actual contributions and circumstances rather than outdated assumptions about who needed help and who could provide it. The new document distributed assets fairly while including provisions for Emma's education and healthcare that would support her future without undermining Jessica's parental responsibilities. As I reflect on this incredible journey, I realize that sometimes the most difficult challenges become opportunities for the most meaningful growth. Our family's financial crisis forced us to confront problems that had been building for years, creating space for healthier relationships based on honesty, respect, and genuine care for each other's well-being. The foundation continues to grow, touching more lives and creating positive changes in our community. Emma is developing into a confident, responsible young woman who understands both the importance of family support and the necessity of personal accountability. Jessica, Brandon, and my parents have all discovered capabilities and strengths they didn't know they possessed. Most importantly, Sarah and I are building our life together on the foundation of a family that has learned to navigate challenges with integrity and resilience. The lessons we learned during our crisis will serve us well as we create our own traditions and face whatever challenges the future may bring. Have you ever faced a situation where setting boundaries with family members felt impossible but necessary? How did you find the balance between helping people you love and enabling behaviors that ultimately harm everyone involved? I would love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you or helped you think differently about family relationships and financial boundaries, please give it a like and share it with others who might benefit from these insights. Your engagement helps me create more content that explores real-life challenges and the growth that can come from facing them honestly. Subscribe to stay connected with more stories about personal growth, family dynamics, and the courage it takes to make difficult but necessary changes in our lives. Thank you for joining me on this journey and for being part of a community that believes in the power of transformation and the possibility of positive change.